Good morning and good afternoon to those of you dialing into our discussion on the changing face of global tech and tech policy. Before we get started, if you'd like to ask the panelists a question, please use the chat function on Zoom or send an email to gcl.rsvp@global-council.com. I'm pleased to be joined by Global Council Chairman Peter Mandelson. Lord Mandelson is a former European Trade Commissioner and British First Secretary of State. On the line, we also have Sumant Mondal, the managing partner and co-founder of March Capital. Sumant has spent nearly 20 years in the venture capital and is the co-founder of two leading technology incubators in San Francisco Bay Area. Peter, I'll turn the call over to you.
Thanks, Miranda, very much. And thank you, by the way, you and your colleagues for all that you're doing in operating the Global Council office in DC. You're doing a brilliant job there. Sumant, it's great to meet you. I mean, this conversation that we're having is sort of technology meets politics. You have a great background as a major tech investor, and I come from the world of politics in the UK and in Europe. Technology and its platforms are now sort of center stage in all our lives, but equally politics and the politicization of almost every single issue is becoming more volatile and less predictable than ever. So I think we have the makings of a good discussion. Let me ask you, first of all, if I may, how you see technology developments currently in the investor landscape. I mean, we're in the grip of a pandemic, COVID-19. How is this changing the landscape and the technology sector? I mean, what do you see accelerating out of it, and what might potentially slow things up?
So, Peter, I think I'll say a few things and maybe we'll have a discussion around it, but I will leave more of the politics to you, because essentially I don't understand what's happening in the world of politics these days. I will say the pandemic has been an interesting, very sad in the world and obviously has had many effects on the population in the world. And in our world, in the world of technology, there was an immediate reaction and then a settling down, and now a projection or a belief in what's going to happen in the future. So it's gone through a certain amount of, I'd say, a development that maybe we could discuss. So, last time you and I had a discussion, we had a conversation a week ago. You were waiting for British Telecom to come to your house to fix your Wi-Fi, if I remember rightly. And what you realize is this new reality we live in has forced down our throats changes that were potentially going to happen anyway, but are now must happen for the world to keep functioning in some capacity. So one easy sort of reaction to this is, hey, people can't go to their offices or have to work from home. So collaboration tools like the one we are using right now become essential commodities. But the network infrastructure, the internet that we take for granted, was not architected for this. So it requires a complete reimagining of this infrastructure for people to be able to get the benefit of it as we were getting when we were working from an office. That also leads you down to the path of, hey, listen, 80% of the world's software runs inside a building, inside someone's data center, inside someone's enterprise. And if you can't get to your enterprise, how will you access the software that your business runs on? So you'll notice that the cloud, which is companies delivering applications from the cloud, have done incredibly well through this pandemic. And we went through a dip in March and April, but if you look at cloud software, public companies, there's tons and tons of examples of private companies we can talk about, but even public companies, and just look at their performance, it's been incredible. So I think in some ways, what you have to imagine is 10 years of behavior change within businesses, within people, in how they consume products, how they consume services, how they consume entertainment, has been accelerated down to, in the last 6-9 months, it has become I would say, not just a trend, but a reality. So it's, in some ways, what you can say is the world of technology and software and the world we live in has become more important than ever before. And so, we can go down different layers of it. Another very interesting aspect, which I'd love to touch on with you, is the concept of security and cybersecurity, and how, as we have moved away from architectures that were created to stop cyber attacks, which is we're no longer within the perimeter of an enterprise, and the footprint of how people are accessing the network has changed. What does that mean to the future of the work environment, of the human environment? Cyber threats are through the roof.
You've immediately identified two areas of expansion or new opportunities that are fast accelerating. One is the creation and the provision of cloud services that universalize your sort of access to software. You don't have to go into a building. You don't have to. So everything comes from the cloud. Number one, very big opportunity, very big development, and the other is securing what you're doing from cyber attack and people hacking in and stealing your information. So those are two immediately identified areas of expansion, which also present major commercial opportunities. Let me ask you then, in relation both to those things, but more broadly, would you say that the US is still the global leader in innovation in technology and provision of technology-based services and creation of platforms, or and if depending on your answer to that question, where do you see Europe? Where do you see Europe sitting on that innovation map?
I will say, Peter, and this is another interesting conversation with you, would be an interesting conversation with you. My view of the world is US centric because I live here. I live in California, and about 70-80% of what we do is here in the US. Having said that, I think over the last decade, US supremacy in research and development has been challenged by China. And I wouldn't say it's been challenged by Europe today, but Europe is obviously a friend, and we hope continues to stay a friend of the US in many ways. But the sheer scale and size of the Chinese market and what the Chinese companies, the large internet companies and technology companies have been able to do for many reasons, policy being one really important part of that, has threatened US supremacy in certain areas, especially areas like artificial intelligence, areas like mobile payments, areas like e-commerce and search. And so when you come outside of the US and you look at the rest of the world, and India is an interesting case study of where the US and Chinese companies have had some competition, some land grab, some developments. US is no longer the only place that innovation comes from. Is the US innovating? Absolutely is. It continues to. But it has definitely, in the last decade, we have seen other centers of innovation come up. Now, Europe is very interesting. Europe, it's a broader conversation. I'd love your thoughts on this. Culturally, entrepreneurship has been rewarded here in the US. In certain Western parts of the world, entrepreneurship is looked upon positively. When I was growing up in India, there was no choice but to be an entrepreneur. Very few corporate paths to success. People had to be entrepreneurial. So I grew up in a business family. So it was kind of second nature to be an entrepreneur. But not every culture is entrepreneurial. And I think part of the representation of a culture is reflected in policy as well. And then policy it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have culture and policy leads to action and the ability for people to innovate, to be entrepreneurs and create new things. So I'd love your thoughts on how you see Europe fitting into that.
Let's come back to Europe, because I think it's a very interesting discussion. to have, because essentially, I mean, Europe can't quite make up its mind whether it wants to be a sort of global producer and exporter of technology-based products, or whether it wants to be the world's biggest exporter of technology regulation, or ideally both. But some people looking at Europe would suggest that, you know, our biggest exponential export at the moment is regulation, rather than goods or services. Let's come back to that. I mean, you say entrepreneurship and entrepreneurialism drives innovation. Would you say that of China? I mean, is there the same entrepreneurial drive in China that's encouraged or permitted within the Chinese system as it is in the West? Or put it a different way, do you get a combination of the best in China, which is a mixture of entrepreneurialism, but also massive intervention by and backing by the state? So you get a combination of public and private in China, which we don't mirror, you know, in Europe or the United States.
I think the Chinese, so first, I think the Chinese culture is entrepreneurial. My first visit to China was in the early 80s, where it was still, everybody wore the same thing. And you had these stores called the friendship stores. I don't know if you remember those, Peter, because when you had a certain type of currency, you could walk in and buy something. And if you didn't have the foreign currency, then as a local, you were not allowed into those stores. So even then you had entrepreneurs standing outside those stores exchanging currency with you so that they could buy goods that were not available to them. So I think the Chinese culture is entrepreneurial. What the Chinese have done, which has created for the opportunity to create global scale, is that they did not allow foreign competition within their domestic market. Now, we can talk about this in today's environment, because every country realizes, or every big country sort of thinks about data as being their sovereign wealth, and is trying to hold on to it, which is what Europe is doing now with GDPR, and India is doing now with data sovereignty, and other countries are coming to it, but it's a little bit late in the game. China did that early and did that really well for their own benefit, which allowed for the creation of companies like Alibaba and Tencent and others. They also have a massive population. I mean, it's, if you think about just their mobile payments network is 900 million people. I mean, just the idea of that, trying to do that in the Western world is difficult to imagine. So there is that, they have that benefit. The second part of what they did, well or not well, depending on where you think of privacy versus ability to innovate, is that they allowed the use of data in a way that the Western world does not. They allowed companies to use data where it would be threatening to a population in the West because of privacy concerns.
This is a very interesting insight, because essentially what you're describing is a massive advantage that China has that stems from its entrepreneurialism, its the state backing of that entrepreneurialism, plus the scale, the size of its population, and the lack of privacy.
And one more layer to this, Peter, they don't have to worry about a 4-year election cycle. So you can plan for 100 years.
So there's no political volatility.
I'm sure there is, but not that. Not that I have to stand up and show what I've done every 3-4 years.
No, yeah. And then when people talk about India as the emerging giant, as the country, the economy that's sort of coming up swiftly on the inside track, how realistic is that? Because I mean, does India have the same attributes and the same advantages as China? Not quite, I don't think.
Not quite, no. And so as someone who grew up there and has had experience working in India and then has been investing in Indian technology companies, India has always been the market that's just about to happen. It's on the verge of becoming a real market. And it keeps getting better and it keeps getting more interesting, but it's very difficult to make money in that country. It's hyper competitive. There's copycats on every business model you can possibly imagine. And if you build scale, it's very difficult for someone else to come in and then disintermediate you. Good example of that is our friends at Reliance, but others as well, and because of the way families are set up and capital, and estates are set up, and it's been a very difficult market for new entrants, new entrepreneurs to go create scale. They have done it, but it's been difficult. Now, India has also been open to most degrees in the last 2 decades, open for foreign companies to come and do business in. Now, whether you do it in joint venture or you do, certain things have been more open than others, but the Facebook of India is Facebook. The WhatsApp of India is WhatsApp. There's no local today competition of size and scale that matters. Now, there's 3 camps in India. There's the Chinese camp. You had the Alibabas of the world that came in and started working with Indian companies. And, there's a company called Paytm that Alibaba owns a big chunk of, trying to be the Alibaba of India. You have the local incumbents like Reliance that launched an incredible mobile platform in Jio and what they've done since then and created for sort of the conduit for most foreign companies to come in and participate in the Indian economy. And then you have the Amazons and the Flipkarts, which is Walmart, trying to replicate what they've done in other parts of the world in India. And so you have now these major big camps starting to develop in India, but they're going after a very small market. I mean, India is a big population, but the number of people that actually engage in online commerce is not that big. It's still under, maybe it's 150 million people,
So the problem with India then is that it has an underdeveloped market. Also, does it not have market rules that promote competition to the same extent as we have in the West? I mean, Reliance is a very dominant player.
Yes, it's access. The US and most of the Western world, you don't need to have special access to create business. In China and in India, other parts of the world, you do. And having that access can create for a competitive differentiation. That's my belief. Now, what India has done recently, which has been very encouraging for people like me, is take a leaf out of the Israel book of technology, which is building software and services that they can export to the rest of the world. Not just for the Indian market, but build a product which is competitive globally. And so I'd say there's about, maybe 50 to 100 software as a service cloud companies that are developing products in India today that have built business outside of the country and are looking to grow their footprint and become global majors, but by attacking the global market, not by just the Indian market. And so I think if China has not done that, so Chinese companies have, especially in the enterprise space, not exported their business out of China and become globally dominant. They have on the consumer side to some degree, but not on the business side, not on the enterprise side. So I think for us, watching the Indian market develop, huge pools of talent, super talented people who've been trained by these companies like the Facebooks and the Twitters and all of those that have, or the Accentures that have hundreds of thousands of people working for them in the country, that are now building product that can compete globally. That's been an interesting phenomenon. So we have companies that serve the Indian market. Scale is massive. When you get to scale, you can actually build a really good company. But we also have exposure to companies that are building product that can compete globally.
Okay, but I thought you said that the problem with India is that it has a relatively undeveloped market, and therefore it's not scaling in the ways and to the extent it should do if it were really to fulfill its potential.
I think the challenge with India is purchasing power and the population's ability to spend money versus the ability, and if you don't have that, you don't have the margin then, and if you can build a company of scale, you can be very valuable, but it's very difficult to build a company of scale. I'm not sure if I'm being clear about the challenges. But the challenge in India always has been for me, where's the money? Like, who's going to pay for this?
Yeah, yeah. But that's why, product developers and producers might look to global markets rather than to India, because the purchasing power, the expertise, the R&D, the innovation exists in India, but the purchasing power tends to exist outside.
And, look, Indian outsourcers over the last 2-3 decades, the BPOs, the IT consulting companies have done really well and have built businesses of scale. What's changed now, though, Peter, it's not just selling manpower. It's actually selling innovation. It's selling product that is being developed in country. I'll give you an example. We have a company in our portfolio which is built in artificial intelligence-based system that allows you to infer things from our conversation in real time on top of voice. Because that company was built in India, 27 different languages, it had to build a platform that could work in multi-language. Today, it's the only company in the world that can actually apply AI to over 100 languages. So as you and I are speaking, this company can tell you whether what I'm saying is 50% true or 30% true or 70% true. It's based on inflection, it's based on intent, it's based on understanding context, all of that. But because they were built in India, they were built multilingual. They had to be a business. And that allows them now to be competitive globally. So there's stuff like that the local market enables you to do because you have no choice, that then allows you to go and compete globally. So, many such examples, Peter, going after small, medium businesses. If you can start building products and services in India that you can sell much cheaper than the rest of the world, you can compete. But you have to be innovative to figure out how you use that to be globally competitive.
Sumant, that's fascinating. Can I take you on to another dimension of this? Still in the broad area of technological innovation and what's catching the eye and the attention of investors like yourself. But let me ask you this. The presence of the big tech giants, in the United States, in Europe, across the West, and elsewhere. You've got Google in search, Facebook in social media, Amazon in e-commerce, Netflix in film, and of course the mighty Apple. To what extent do you think the continued growth and dominance of these big tech businesses are stimulating further innovation, development of product, growth of markets, or actually suppressing it? That they're like a big sort of
dampener,
sort of cushion that is pressing down on the smaller innovators, the smaller product developers, and that part of the challenge to big tech is necessary, not from a sort of privacy or content point of view. We can come and discuss that in the moment, but from the point of view of innovation, of new products, services, to what extent do you think their domination and their ability to sort of gobble up everything that moves and then park it somewhere within their vast empires is actually having a suppressive effect on innovation and product development in the West?
So it's actually both an enabler and a suppressor. In some ways, I think these big platforms have created channels for innovative products and services to reach consumers. And some do a better job than others. For example, I think Apple with its stores has done an incredible job allowing for application developers to bring their products to hundreds of millions of people. They take their tax, they take their 30% or whatever that is, but at least you have that channel. Whereas you have companies like Amazon that has allowed for small e-commerce vendors to get their products and services to their customers. So on the other hand, what they do really well, because of the scale that they have, is impossible for a new company to compete with. So my answer is neither here nor there, it's both. you have to learn how to dance with giants to be able to build a company of size and scale in the world that they dominate in. So can I see a new e-commerce vendor come up and compete with Amazon? Not directly, but you have to come up with a different model. Like you could have a company like Wish that has done well, or Etsy that has done well. You know, so you do have little areas around which you can innovate, but you can't go directly at Amazon and say, I'm going to compete with you, because their understanding of how they've built their supply chain and how they built their delivery systems and how that's almost very, you know, it's difficult to replicate unless you can spend hundreds of billions of dollars doing it. So there is that challenge. Some companies are easier to partner with than others. Some companies are better acquirers than others. So it's, you know, I think this next administration is going to have some interesting decisions to make on how they apply their antitrust learnings and laws, or even execute on existing regulation, which has been difficult to execute on because it was never written with these kinds of entities in mind.
But I have to say to you that if you take the balance of political and regulatory opinion, it is that these tech giants, as a broad observation, have flipped from being enablers to suppressors. Now, that's a broad generalization, and no doubt, you know, many could contest.
And they will contest, Peter, that their market is no longer just the US, that they compete globally. And so their big competition is the Chinese companies. And if you suppress them, then the US is a loser compared to what the Chinese companies can do. And so there's...
Yeah, but here's the point. If within an economy like US or Europe, you know, you need constant innovation to refresh, to refine, to develop product, to provide new services, that constantly expanding and creating new markets. If that process of sort of constant innovation and renewal is being inhibited by the dominance of these big tech businesses, then okay, you know, in the meantime, you might say, well, big tech is a brilliant rival for, you know, for the Chinese. But in the medium and longer term, you could argue that that innovation is being slowed up or suppressed in the West because of that dominance, and that this will inhibit our growth in the West, and actually in the longer term give a major advantage to Chinese businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I will say there's rise and fall of empires, and every 2 decades, 10 years, or every 20 years, you can see the top 20 companies or top 50 companies in the exchanges and how that has changed over every decade. I'll talk about the enterprise software space, which is very different, a little bit different from the consumer software space that you just talked about. And if you look at just cloud software and the dominance of companies like Salesforce and ServiceNow and Workday, et cetera, there's still not more than 20% of the market cap or the revenue of software as a service. So 80%, it's a very, very broad range of companies that encompass that value. So there is always innovation happening. There's always new companies coming on board. Zoom is an interesting example. You had tons of video conferencing companies before Zoom came in. They had really no need for another one, in some ways. And you had a person who was just incessantly driven by creating simplicity. The reason Zoom works better than Microsoft Teams or Google, whatever, any other product, is because it's very simple to use. And so he innovated around one aspect of a certain value proposition and has created a company where, I don't know what the market cap today is, but tens of billions, if not $100 billion of equity value. Now, obviously, the pandemic has helped his business model. But opportunity always exists to create innovation. I don't think for real innovators, the existence of a Google or Apple or Amazon will stop them from innovating. That's my personal belief.
Do you think that the next generation of technology, 5G, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, will fundamentally alter this picture? I mean, perhaps in a favorable way, it will open up further opportunities and stimulate innovation further? Or are we seeing, in relation to that new generation of technology, an extension of the dominance that's already becoming the hallmark
I know I understand the question, but I will say it'll be both. And I can tell you that every 5 to 10 years, used to be 10 years, and let's say every 5 years, there's a fundamental new technology platform that enters the market. And it starts from my involvement in technology started from the PC, but before that, client server or mainframes, and then the PC, then the internet, then mobile. 2006 when the iPhone came out, and then the cloud became dominant or became the fundamental technology. Today we talk about 5G and artificial intelligence, or let's just say data-driven differentiation. I always say that I'm in a world that will continue to have opportunity, because every time a new foundational technology comes there, there's a wave of innovation that is driven by it. So what does 5G mean? 5G means that you have a low power consumption, zero latency, high bandwidth network available to you wherever you are. What does that mean? Does that mean I can stream my Netflix for longer? Probably, but what's really it's going to drive the Internet of Things. So in some ways, these things are very connected. Why do I need to drive the Internet of Things? Because I now have AI-driven technologies that can actually extract some intelligence from all the data I'm collecting. So it kind of builds on top of each other. Will Google build something around this? Will Microsoft? They will, but there will also be a dozen, 25, 50 new unicorns that will be created just because these new technologies allow for new value propositions. So will they buy something? How many things has Google really innovated on versus acquired? One can argue not many, right? They just acquire anything new.
Yeah, I think that I suppose it depends on how you view these big tech companies as major drivers of innovation, creators of opportunity, stimulators of new business and expansion, or whether, as increasingly in Europe, they're being viewed as gatekeepers that are standing in the way of innovation, new businesses, acquiring, fresh market.
Yeah, I can see that from the top-down view. From the bottoms-up view, a lot of new innovation is happening around us all the time. We're in the middle of it. So I don't see this, I guess I don't see this from the same perspective. I also think that the US California perspective and the European perspective may be quite different viewing these companies. In fact, I think Washington, DC perspective versus California perspective may be very different as well.
But Sumant, it may be the case that DC and Brussels are now operating on the same page in relation to these big technology companies. I mean, the European Commission, which is the day-to-day sort of powerhouse and administration of the European Union, is due to publish a further landmark piece of digital services legislation in December. I mean, this follows on, it's not the same as, but it follows on from its sort of gold standard landmark GDPR legislation. And the first pillar of this Digital Services Act or legislation will involve designating platforms deemed dominant as gatekeepers and imposing obligations on them with the aim of limiting their power to dominate, to exclude, to stifle innovation of other businesses in order to promote competition. I mean, this is becoming known as ex-ante regulation. I mean, rather than allowing basically all these big tech companies sort of trailblaze, do what they want, and acquire domination in markets, which then regulators then have to challenge, try to unpick, with huge investigatory and legal rigmarole. You instead, you constrain them or place them within a framework, a permanent framework from the outset, which lays down what these gatekeepers henceforth will be allowed to do. So you're in a sense, you're more than clipping their wings. I mean, you're seriously putting them into a much very different legal and operational framework. Now, that is the thrust of this European legislation, which is being drawn up at the moment. And I know that in DC, a lot of the House antitrust activity has drawn on European experience and European thinking. And that it may well be that this sort of concept of gatekeepers and the need to limit them, and as I say, just constrain them,
which is not
may well be on its way to the United States as well. If you get a blue wave following these elections, and you get a Biden presidency in the White House and Democratic control of Congress, you may find that you may find actually this concept of gatekeepers and the need to constrain them is going to completely change the political and legislative approach to big tech in quite a radical way.
And in its by itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing for the tech ecosystem if something like that happens. If it's applied universally, I don't think it should be applied in one dimension versus not in another. So Peter, I don't think it's just going to have to change the way people think of how they do their business. I don't think it takes away their dominance in certain aspects. So look, I mean, I'll come back to the enterprise SaaS cloud-driven businesses as an example. There are super big dominant businesses like Salesforce and others, but it's still, if you combine the top 10, it's still not more than 20% of the market. So there is a huge long tail of software companies that are innovating and creating value. Regulation, in my mind, also in many ways helps the incumbent, and it stops a new wave of innovation from coming in. Payments is a very good example. Digital payments is a highly regulated business. But what that does is it stops a new, smaller company from entering because they don't meet the criteria to be in the regulated framework. So in some of our businesses, regulation has actually helped the incumbent more than it has helped the new entrant.
Okay, that's a very important point, because they're big enough to find their way through and around and navigate their way out the other side from regulation. But the sort of legislation that's now being envisaged, Suman, both in Europe and to an extent, if there's a sort of copycat
highly possible
action catches on in DC, is legislation that enables regulators to target up to 20 large internet companies, including Google, including Facebook, with rules that force them to share data with their rivals, that stop that sort of limit their sort of verticalization of their business
with their
and avoid them tying and self-preferencing their own products, etc. I mean, which is the better way to create new value, to stimulate innovation and to create new value? Is it for regulators to step aside, in your view, and to allow the market to continue to find its own balance and its own way of working, or alternatively, have regulators intervene in a completely new way to target and constrain the 20 largest internet companies, so that everyone else is given the opportunity to breathe, to develop their products and to develop market share?
I think it's a question of maturity of the industry and what's in the benefit of the end consumer. So I'll give you a very funny example. 20 years ago, I hosted the Minister of Information Technology from India at my business school.
Yeah.
And he was a very funny guy, and he comes to the classroom or whatever, and he says, the reason why the information technology industry in India boomed and did really well in the 90s, the whole Y2K, if you remember all of that drama, is because the government didn't know it existed. We didn't have a Ministry of Information Technology, so people were allowed to go and do what they needed to do and innovate. And now it has gone to a place of certain size and scale where it's affecting people's lives. So the government has to intervene and create for rules, or create for a playing field which creates for equality for people to compete with each other. So I think that big tech has come to a place where regulation is needed. And I think it's a philosophical sort of debate whether data, who owns the data? Is it a sovereign wealth, which I think in some cases, some countries would argue that data is owned by the country, not by the company. And how do you control access to and using that data for competitive natures, for competitive offerings? So I do think some regulation is definitely required now that it is of a size and scale where it's affecting everybody's life. And every person that uses that technology, it affects their choices, their ability to make decisions, their ability to access products and services. So I think some nature of regulation is important. But if that regulation had come in 10 years ago, we may not have seen the innovation we have seen today.
Look, time has just flown past and we're nearly at the end of this fascinating conversation. But I want to, if I may, just ask you about one other dimension to this. It's not so much the sort of smart or less than smart regulation that policymakers, lawmakers are pursuing. It's the sort of spate of sort of unilateral actions that we've seen come from the administration during the last 4 years, and the impact that's having on the tech landscape. I mean, we've seen successive unilateral actions affecting trade, export controls, sanctions, and investment barriers in core tech fields, all of which are reducing essentially the ability of US companies to collaborate freely, internationally, and on new tech advancements. Now, these actions are clearly aimed at harming China's technological rise and protecting US tech interests. But could there be an unforeseen consequence of this, that actually what you're seeing is not US technology interests being protected by this action of the administration, but actually the growing isolation of the US tech sector from international R&D and the potential for collaboration that exists through that, and that actually these actions designed to protect US tech interests having a perverse effect, could they actually inhibit innovation in the United States?
Yes, it absolutely.
US tech away from what's going on elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, I think any action has a reaction, and so this will create for now a cascade effect of things, and hopefully we're not too late in the game to figure out how to balance it. But the US companies, I'm not sure the US has seen that yet. Any kind of either retaliation or blocking from being able to compete.
You may not have seen retaliation at a political level, but I can tell you in Asia, I've come across businesses which are increasingly wary of buying US technology, given the politicization of supply chains and the vulnerability of these businesses to future US sanctions and policy interventions as a result of geopolitics and what is becoming possibly a misguided or perverse attempt to protect US interests, that it would be better not to have anything, not rely on US technology, not to buy into it, not to
What's the choice, Peter?
the US supply chain, because you never know when some sort of ex cathedra intervention isn't going to come from somewhere in the administration and cut you off at the legs.
I couldn't agree with you more. But having said that, there are very few choices people have if they don't engage with these US companies, right? There's not much. If I wanted to use word processing as an example, what platform do I have outside of maybe Google Docs or Microsoft? Like, what choice do I have? And so I will say, though, that technology products and their ability to compete globally, or being allowed to compete, has become a sovereign decision. So for example, when India and China had the border clash, India banned 200 Chinese apps. They didn't put import controls on goods, but they banned 200 apps. So that's the new leverage that I think sovereigns have in negotiations with each other.
Yeah,
it's a very important component of trade.
It is, and the point I'm making is that, US government actions seem to have become increasingly capricious and arbitrary and governed by politics and not commerce. You say, well, fine, but people don't have a choice. They have to go American. Well, China is developing potentially alternatives.
China has the alternatives.
And many in Asia may feel that they can look to China for greater consistency.
Absolutely right.
Than you get from the United States.
I'm certainly hoping, Peter, that in 10 days we will feel that there is a little more hope.
I'm not asking you to express a partisan view.
I won't go further than that. Let's put it that way.
All right. Look, it's been great talking to you. We're not so far away from knowing what the outcome of what I think most people in Europe regard as the most important election that we have known anywhere in the world in our lifetimes. I mean, we feel so much is hanging on it, that it's a massive hit on which a lot of public policy will swing one way or the other.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
It's been great talking to you, Sumant. I'm so grateful to you for your time, as will all those who have been participating in this conversation.
Likewise, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.